The old man was humiliated when he asked for a simple sandwich. However, a chance encounter with a mysterious young woman helped him and his wife release all the unresolved emotions about the death of their son, including the girl's feelings of guilt. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The air inside the cozy New York cafe was thick with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the muffled clinking of cups. It was a familiar morning scene, filled with the city's professionals, each occupied with their own conversations, phone screens, or laptops. Outside, the bustling city's pulse was palpable, even through the cafe's thick glass windows, where people moved with the usual urgency of urban life. But as the door swung open, a peculiar silence swept through the cafe. Heads turned, eyes subtly shifting towards the elderly man who had just entered. Henry, an 89-year-old man, frail and visibly weary, stood at the doorway. His shoulders slumped under the weight of both age and time, and his steps were slow, shuffling with the slightest hesitation. His clothes, once crisp and clean, were now threadbare and faded, barely enough to shield him from the early winter chill. His shoes, scuffed and worn to the point of showing his toes, seemed like they had walked through countless seasons of hardship. He looked around the cafe, his eyes scanning the room without really focusing on anyone, as though he wanted to avoid the stares he knew would come. His hand, slightly shaking, clutched a few coins. He felt their weight, not because of their value, but because it was all he had. His other hand reached up to steady himself, brushing against an old tarnished watch strapped to his thin wrist. Finally, he took a deep breath and shuffled toward the counter. Behind the counter stood Samantha, the cafe's middle-aged owner, her sharp eyes catching every detail. Known for her cold demeanor and no-nonsense attitude, Samantha's gaze quickly turned to a look of disdain. She glanced up and down at Henry, her face showing clear disapproval, her lips pressed into a thin line. The pristine white apron she wore only served to highlight the hardened lines on her face, evidence of years of dealing with city customers, though not of the type Henry represented. Henry placed his coins on the counter, barely daring to look up as he spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper. Just a small sandwich, please," he murmured, his fingers fumbling with the coins as he attempted to arrange them in a neat pile, hoping his humility would make up for his lack of funds. But Samantha merely crossed her arms, her gaze icy. "This isn't a shelter, old man," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "If you don't have the money, then you don't eat here." Her words, though softly spoken, struck Henry like a physical blow. His shoulders drooped further, and he felt a burning sensation in his cheeks. Humiliation washed over him as whispers started to ripple through the cafe. Customers glanced his way, some with discomfort, others with pity, but none with a willingness to intervene. Henry's hands trembled as he stammered out, "Please, anything you can spare. I haven't eaten." His voice trailed off, barely audible, but his words echoed loudly in the silent judgment of those around him. His empty stomach gnawed painfully, and he felt his pride slipping away with each second that passed. Samantha took a step forward, leaning across the counter, her voice dripping with disdain. "We don't have leftovers here," she spat. "So unless you can pay, you need to leave." At that, a few patrons chuckled quietly, and a man at a nearby table shook his head with a mocking smile. "Yeah, beat it, old man," he muttered under his breath. Henry's heart sank, and his vision blurred as tears pooled in his eyes. He felt invisible, reduced to nothing but an object of scorn. He wasn't sure if he should turn and leave or try to persist a little longer. His stomach's painful growl was matched only by the ache in his chest. Just as Henry was on the verge of giving up, the door opened again, and a new presence filled the room. In walked Julia, a well-dressed woman in her early 40s, her neatly styled brown hair and sharp navy blue suit marking her as a figure of importance. She moved with an air of confidence that immediately caught everyone's attention, her presence exuding both grace and authority. Her eyes quickly scanned the scene before her, narrowing slightly as they landed on Henry's defeated figure at the counter. Julia's gaze shifted between Henry and Samantha, her brows furrowing as she pieced together what was happening. And then, her eyes fell on something else, an old watch strapped around Henry's wrist. For a fleeting moment, a flash of recognition crossed her face, her heart skipping a beat as a faint, forgotten memory stirred within her. Without a moment's hesitation, Julia stepped forward, her heels clicking firmly against the cafe's polished floor, her gaze fixed on Samantha. The room seemed to hold its breath as Julia approached the counter. Samantha looked up, startled, as Julia's commanding presence cast a shadow over her. "Excuse me," Julia said, her voice calm yet laced with a cool authority. "Is there a problem here?" Samantha hesitated, taken aback by Julia's directness. No problem," she stammered, though her voice held a defensive edge. "It's just, we can't have people coming in here expecting charity." Julia's gaze hardened. "This man is asking for a simple meal. He's not here to beg," she replied, her tone unwavering. "And if he were, is that reason enough to deny him some dignity?" A silence fell over the cafe. All eyes were on the two women, each standing firm, the tension between them palpable. Samantha, clearly uncomfortable, attempted to regain her composure, but Julia's intense gaze didn't waver. Henry, who had remained silent through the exchange, looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief and hope. Julia turned to him and offered a gentle smile, reaching out her hand. "Sir, please take a seat. Lunch is on me today." Henry stared at her, his mouth slightly open in shock. His eyes filled with gratitude, a tear escaping and rolling down his cheek as he accepted her invitation with a shaky nod. Julia then returned her gaze to Samantha, her voice carrying a subtle but undeniable strength. "In all my years as a customer here, I never imagined I'd see someone treated this way. Every human being deserves respect, Samantha, regardless of their situation." The cafe had fallen into complete silence, customers watching with a mixture of admiration for Julia and discomfort at Samantha's blatant prejudice. Under Julia's unwavering stare, Samantha finally relented, stepping back with a huff, her face flushed with embarrassment. Henry, guided by Julia's reassuring presence, made his way to a table. She gestured for him to sit, then placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. For the first time in what felt like years, he felt seen. As Henry settled into the seat Julia had offered him, he looked around, still half expecting the cafe's patrons to scoff or look away. But something had changed in the air. The sense of disdain had softened, replaced by a quiet murmur of curiosity. Julia's presence seemed to command respect, and even those who had looked at Henry with pity or contempt now avoided her gaze, as if suddenly unsure of their own feelings. Julia turned to Samantha, her gaze steady and unyielding. "I'll have a sandwich and coffee for the gentleman here," she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that left no room for objection. Samantha, who had just regained her composure, bristled slightly. She was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by one of her wealthiest patrons, but Julia's unwavering stare left her with little choice. With a barely audible sigh, she forced a smile and nodded, turning to prepare the order. The cafe owner's forced cordiality only underscored her discomfort, and her movements were stiff, her eyes darting between Julia and Henry. Julia took the seat opposite Henry, her expression softening as she looked at him. "Sir, I'm Julia," she introduced herself, her tone warm and inviting. "I hope you don't mind me stepping in like that." Henry's hands trembled slightly, still clutching his few coins. He looked down, almost ashamed, and managed a small, tentative smile. "Thank you, ma'am," he murmured. I didn't know if anyone would care." Julia shook her head, her gaze steady and compassionate. "There's no need to thank me," she replied softly. "Everyone deserves a bit of kindness, and you—" Her eyes drifted to his wrist, where the old watch sat loosely on his thin arm, its face scratched and worn, but clearly cherished. Something about the watch sparked a memory in Julia, a memory that felt so distant, yet so close. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen this watch before. Its classic design and the way it caught the light felt hauntingly familiar. She tried to shake off the thought, refocusing on the man sitting before her. The sandwich and coffee arrived, placed on the table by Samantha, with a stiff, uncomfortable nod. Henry looked down at the meal, his eyes widening slightly in disbelief. The simple sandwich seemed like a feast to him, and his hand hovered over it, as if he were afraid it might vanish if he touched it. "Please eat," Julia encouraged, her voice gentle. Henry nodded, his hand finally moving to take the sandwich. He took a small, hesitant bite, chewing slowly, savoring each morsel. For a moment, his eyes closed, as if he were letting the taste fill him with warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. Julia watched him with quiet empathy. She could sense the depth of his gratitude, and it filled her with an unexpected sense of purpose. The simplicity of the act, the offering of a meal to someone in need, felt like a small yet profound gesture in a world that often seemed indifferent. As Henry took another bite, he looked up, meeting her gaze. His voice was a little stronger now, though still tentative. "I used to come here sometimes, when my wife and I were younger," he said, his tone laced with nostalgia. "Back then it was a smaller place, but she always loved the coffee." Julia leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "Did you live nearby?" Henry nodded, swallowing before he spoke. "Yes, not far from here. But life changes, you know." He managed a small, wistful smile. "People, they move on, or they lose things along the way. My wife, Margaret, she's waiting for me now, back at a small park nearby. We don't have much, but—" His voice trailed off, a shadow crossing his face as he fought to maintain his composure. Julia's expression softened even more. She could sense the weight of years and struggles behind Henry's words, and she felt a surge of empathy for both him and his wife. She leaned back, giving him the space to speak if he wished, but she knew better than to pry too deeply. "Margaret, she's been strong," Henry continued after a moment, his voice barely a whisper. "But it's hard. We lost so much. People just pass us by, and sometimes it feels like we're invisible." Julia's heart tightened. She couldn't imagine how it must feel to reach an age where the world seemed to move on without you, treating you as if you were a shadow on the street. But as she looked at Henry, she saw a resilience that transcended his frail appearance. Despite everything, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that touched her deeply. Then, almost involuntarily, her gaze drifted back to the watch on his wrist. The design, the scratch on the face, it all felt too familiar to ignore. She couldn't shake the sense that this watch held some connection to her past. "Henry," Julia said gently, choosing her words carefully, "that watch you're wearing, it's a beautiful piece. May I ask where you got it?" Henry looked down at the watch, his thumb brushing over the worn face with a tender touch, as if it were more than just an object, but a piece of his own heart. It belonged to my son, Alexander." His voice softened, and for a moment, he seemed lost in memories. Henry's voice caught, a tremor slipping through. "He passed away some years ago, but this is all I have left of him." Julia's heart skipped a beat, a chill running down her spine as realization hit her. Alexander. The name, so familiar and filled with emotion, flooded her mind with memories. Memories of a young man she had once loved with every part of her being. Her eyes softened as she looked back at Henry, the man before her no longer a stranger, but the father of her Alexander. The father of the man who had been her closest confidant and love, whose sudden absence had left a chasm in her heart that had never quite healed. For a brief, suspended moment, Julia could only sit in stunned silence, feeling as though time itself had stopped. The realization was overwhelming, and her mind raced to process this new understanding. Her gaze drifted down to the watch on Henry's wrist, the watch she had once carefully selected as a gift, a symbol of her affection and their shared dreams. She remembered the way Alexander used to glance at it with a grin, twisting it as he spoke to her, the way it caught the light on sunny days they spent together, imagining a future they would never see. Henry's own gaze had been cast downward, his fingers still resting protectively over the watch's face. But he noticed Julia's change in demeanor and sensed the way her presence had shifted from compassion to something more intimate, more sorrowful. He looked up, a flicker of confusion crossing his face as he studied her. His voice was soft, cautious. You knew him, didn't you?" Julia's throat tightened, her lips parting as she fought to find words that felt inadequate for the emotions rising within her. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She nodded slowly, tears pooling in her eyes. "Yes, I knew him. He meant everything to me." The weight of her words lingered in the air, and Henry's eyes filled with recognition and sorrow, a mirror to her own. The years of grief that had etched lines into his face softened, replaced by a profound sadness they now shared. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, with the unhealed wounds of their mutual loss and memories of Alexander's warmth, his laughter, the way he had left an indelible mark on both of their lives. Henry lowered his gaze, his hand trembling slightly as it brushed over the watch. "Alexander," he began, his voice wavering as he spoke his son's name aloud. "He was more than a son to me. He was my friend, the one person who—" He trailed off, struggling to find words that captured the depth of his feelings. He could always see the good in things. Even when life was difficult, he found hope. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "I never understood how he did it." Julia's face softened, and a faint smile of her own appeared, though it was tinged with a bittersweet longing. "He was like that with me too," she murmured, her voice trembling with the weight of her memories. "Always seeing things I couldn't. His laughter, it could fill a room." She paused, her gaze distant as she remembered. "I loved him so much, Henry. I don't think I've ever stopped." Henry's eyes met hers, and for a moment they were simply two people bound by the memory of a man they had both cherished, a man who had left them far too soon. Henry nodded, understanding the pain in her words, feeling it echo within his own heart. "I never imagined that someone else might have felt that way about him. You see, after he passed—" His voice broke, and he took a shaky breath, his hands clenching slightly as if holding on to the watch could anchor him through the storm of his grief. "Margaret and I, we blamed ourselves for not seeing what he needed, for not understanding him in the way he needed us to. But knowing that he had you, it brings a bit of peace to me." Julia reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "Henry, I think Alexander felt truly loved by you, by his family, and by me." Her voice softened, a tear slipping down her cheek. "In the time we had together, he was happy. He used to talk about you often, about the strength you taught him, the kindness you shared. He loved you." Henry's shoulders sagged slightly, as if a weight had been lifted from him, though the sadness in his eyes remained. "Thank you, Julia," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "You've given me something I didn't know I needed." For both of them, this encounter had become more than a reunion of strangers. It was a moment of unexpected healing. As Julia looked at Henry, she felt a connection that went beyond words. She had come to the cafe that day out of compassion for a stranger, but now, as she sat across from Alexander's father, she realized that fate had brought her here for a reason. Julia finally broke the silence, her voice steady but filled with determination. "Henry, I would like to help you, both you and Margaret. I can't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, I can help make things a little easier now." Henry's face softened, his hand lifting to cover his mouth as he tried to process her words. A glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes, and he blinked back tears. I don't know what to say," he stammered, his voice heavy with gratitude and disbelief. You don't have to do that." Julia shook her head, a gentle smile tugging at her lips, her heart aching and yet filled with a newfound purpose. "I want to," she replied firmly, "for both of you, and for Alexander. I think he would want this." With those words, a sense of peace washed over her, filling the space that had once been occupied by grief and regret. She had finally found a way to honor Alexander's memory, a way to transform her own sadness into a meaningful act of kindness. Henry, still overwhelmed, looked down at the watch, a faint smile of remembrance gracing his face. "You know, he would have loved this," he murmured softly, his voice touched with a warmth that broke through the sadness. Seeing two people he cared about, connecting like this. Julia squeezed his hand gently, feeling as though Alexander's presence was there with them, like a whisper of hope and reconciliation. As they sat together in quiet reflection, the cafe's patrons continued their conversations, unaware of the profound reunion taking place just a few tables away. And in the heart of the bustling city, amidst the noise and commotion, Julia felt a glimmer of closure, knowing that she had finally found a way to bridge the gap between past and present. After their heartfelt exchange, Julia knew that her offer to help Henry and Margaret was just the beginning of something far deeper. She couldn't shake the feeling that fate had intertwined their lives, and there was a part of her that needed to understand more about the life Alexander had led after they parted ways. For Julia, this was no longer just an act of kindness, but a journey to confront her own grief, which had remained unspoken for so many years. As they left the cafe, Henry led Julia to a quiet corner of Central Park, where he and Margaret often spent their days. The park was a refuge, a place where the bustle of the city seemed to fade away, leaving only the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant laughter of children. Henry had asked Margaret to wait for him here, knowing she would feel embarrassed in the cafe. Julia, her heart steady with purpose, felt a mixture of apprehension and compassion for the woman she was about to meet. They found Margaret sitting on a worn bench beneath a large oak tree. Her posture was rigid, and her hands clutched the handles of her old purse tightly. Even from a distance, Julia could see the weight of years and hardship etched onto Margaret's face, lines of sorrow, pride, and defiance. Margaret's gaze shifted when she noticed Henry approaching with Julia by his side, and her expression immediately hardened. "Henry," Margaret began, her voice sharp yet laced with weariness, "who is this?" Henry hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward Julia. "This is Julia," he said softly. "She knew Alexander. She's here to help us." Margaret's eyes narrowed as she examined Julia, suspicion evident in her gaze. "Knew Alexander?" she repeated, her voice tinged with bitterness. How could someone like her know anything about him? Julia took a steady breath, understanding Margaret's pain and her need to defend the memory of her son. She stepped forward, meeting Margaret's gaze with a look of understanding. "I loved him, Margaret," Julia said gently, her voice calm but unwavering. "He was everything to me once. I didn't know that he had gone. I didn't know the sorrow that both of you have had to carry." Margaret's face softened slightly, though skepticism remained in her eyes. "Loved him?" she echoed, almost as if testing the words. "Then, where were you all these years?" Julia's throat tightened. She had expected this question, but hearing it out loud brought a wave of sadness. "Life took us in different directions," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "After we lost touch, I thought he had moved on, found a life of his own. I never stopped caring, but I didn't know." For a moment, silence hung between them, filled with a mix of resentment and vulnerability. Margaret's gaze shifted to the watch on Henry's wrist, her face a mask of sorrow. "Alexander left us with nothing but memories and regrets," she whispered, her voice cracking. "His loss broke us. It broke me." Julia reached out, a compassionate hand extended, but Margaret hesitated, pulling back slightly. Julia felt her heart ache with the weight of Margaret's grief, understanding that this woman had lost more than just a son. She had lost her sense of purpose, her pride, her place in the world. "Margaret," Julia said softly, "I know I can't change the past, but I want to help you both now. I can't replace Alexander, but I can make sure you don't have to face these hardships alone." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly looked away, refusing to let them fall. She tightened her grip on her purse, her knuckles white against the worn leather. "Why would you care?" she asked, her voice laced with years of hurt and mistrust. "Why would you do this for us?" Julia stepped closer, her tone gentle but filled with resolve. "Because Alexander would have wanted it," she replied, "and because I see the two of you as part of him, a part of the life he might have wanted had things been different." Henry placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder, his own eyes brimming with emotion. "Margaret," he murmured, "we can't keep living like this. Julia's offering us a chance, maybe even a way to honor Alexander's memory. Please, let her help." Margaret's posture softened as she listened to Henry's words, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her pride and sorrow. She took a shaky breath, glancing back at Julia, her expression vulnerable yet guarded. "Fine," Margaret said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "But don't expect me to be grateful just yet. I don't know what it is you're after, but if you're here out of pity—" Julia interrupted gently, shaking her head. "This isn't pity, Margaret. This is something I feel compelled to do, for Alexander and for both of you." The words seemed to resonate with Margaret, who finally allowed her shoulders to relax, though her gaze remained cautious. Julia understood that trust would not come easily, but she also knew that this was a necessary step toward healing, not only for Henry and Margaret, but for herself as well. As they stood in silence, Julia felt a subtle sense of peace settle over her. She had come searching for closure, but in helping Alexander's parents, she found herself on a path toward understanding and reconciliation. "Come," she said softly, extending her hand to both Henry and Margaret. "Let me take you somewhere safe and warm. We can figure out the rest together." Henry took her hand gratefully, and after a long, hesitant moment, Margaret followed suit. Julia led them away from the quiet sanctuary of the park, her heart filled with a sense of purpose and a newfound determination to build a bridge between the past and the present. Julia welcomed Henry and Margaret into her home, a cozy brownstone nestled in a quiet New York neighborhood. The air inside was warm, filled with the subtle scent of cinnamon from a candle flickering on the coffee table. For Henry and Margaret, who had spent months on the streets with nothing but cold park benches to rest on, this place felt almost surreal. They looked around, hesitant and unsure, like strangers entering a new world. Julia motioned toward the sofa, offering them a seat, but Margaret remained standing, her shoulders tense, her gaze shifting from Julia to Henry and back again. She held her purse close to her chest, as if fearing that at any moment someone might try to take it from her. "I want you both to make yourselves at home here," Julia said gently. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." Henry gave her a grateful nod and settled into the sofa, but Margaret lingered by the door, her face a mask of mistrust. "This isn't charity, is it?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp. "I don't need anyone's pity. We've managed on our own." Julia held her gaze, understanding the deep-rooted pride that often accompanied hardship. "It's not charity, Margaret," she replied softly. It's friendship, perhaps, and maybe a way to heal for all of us." Margaret's eyes softened for a moment, but she quickly masked her emotions, her defenses still firmly in place. She looked over at Henry, who was already settling in, his eyes closed in silent relief. After a pause, Margaret finally moved to sit beside Henry, but she remained on the edge of the cushion, her hands tightly clasped. Julia could sense that Margaret needed time, that her pride was both a shield and a scar from the years of hardship and loss. She decided not to press her, but instead to give her space to adjust. To ease the tension, Julia brought out a tray with a pot of tea and some warm biscuits she had baked that morning. She poured each of them a cup, the delicate clinking of porcelain filling the silence. "I thought we could sit and talk a little," Julia said, trying to bridge the gap between them. "There's so much I'd like to know about Alexander, if that's all right with you." Henry's face softened, a bittersweet smile crossing his lips. "Our Alexander," he murmured, the words laced with nostalgia. "He was a good man, always full of dreams and laughter." Margaret's expression hardened, and she turned her gaze away. Julia could see the mix of pain and pride in her eyes, as if the memories of her son were too precious to share, yet too painful to hold alone. "Alexander always had this boundless energy," Julia continued, glancing at Margaret for some sign of agreement. "He could make anyone smile. He had that gift." Margaret's posture softened just a little as Julia spoke, her hands loosening their grip on her purse. She glanced briefly at Julia, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "You knew him well, then?" Julia nodded, her own memories blending with Henry's words. "Yes, very well. He was someone who brought light into every room he entered. He had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world." Margaret swallowed, her gaze dropping to her lap. "He was all we had," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "After he was gone, nothing felt right anymore. Our lives just fell apart." Julia could feel the depth of Margaret's grief and the bitter loneliness that came with it. She wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort, but she sensed that Margaret needed to say this on her own terms. For so long she had carried her sorrow alone, and letting anyone in was an act of trust that came with great difficulty. Henry placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. "She's here to help, Margaret," he said softly. Maybe it's time we let someone else share in this burden." Margaret tensed, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the teacup in her hands. "I don't know how to let go of it," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I've held on to him for so long, as if by keeping the pain close, I could keep a piece of him alive." Julia felt a wave of empathy wash over her. She too had clung to her memories of Alexander, keeping them alive as a way to hold on to what they had shared. But now, seeing Henry and Margaret, she realized that holding on to the pain had prevented all of them from finding peace. "You don't have to let go," Julia said gently. "But maybe we can find a way to honor him together, to remember him in a way that brings us peace instead of sorrow." Margaret looked up, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "And how do you suppose we do that?" Julia took a deep breath, her own heart pounding with the weight of this moment. "By forgiving each other and ourselves," she replied, her voice steady. "And by choosing to live in a way that would make him proud." For the first time since they had entered her home, Julia saw a glimmer of hope in Margaret's eyes, a fragile spark that hinted at the possibility of healing. The road ahead would be long, and the wounds they carried would not vanish overnight. But in that quiet, shared moment, they each took a small step toward forgiveness and understanding. The afternoon faded into evening as they continued talking, sharing memories of Alexander and allowing the warmth of their shared love for him to fill the spaces that grief had hollowed out. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky outside Julia's window, she felt a sense of quiet determination settle within her. This journey was just beginning, but with Henry and Margaret by her side, Julia knew they would find a way to move forward, to build a new life, shaped not by loss, but by the strength of love and resilience. The days following Margaret and Henry's arrival at Julia's home brought a mixture of emotions for everyone involved. Margaret, still holding on to her guarded nature, moved cautiously within the house, as if each step reminded her that she was living in someone else's space. Henry, on the other hand, embraced the warmth and comfort, finding solace in the small routines Julia encouraged. Julia, watching over them, felt both the weight and the reward of what she had taken on. She was beginning to see a slow transformation in them, though Margaret's trust remained hard-won. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, Julia decided to initiate a small gesture of togetherness. She prepared a simple breakfast, warm oatmeal with berries, fresh toast, and coffee brewing in the pot. She placed the dishes on the table and called for Margaret and Henry, hoping that a shared meal might ease some of the invisible walls between them. Margaret entered the kitchen, her gaze flitting across the table, her posture still tense. She seemed almost wary, as though she were waiting for something to go wrong. "Please sit," Julia invited with a warm smile, pulling out chairs for both of them. Henry settled into his seat, giving Julia a grateful nod. "This looks wonderful, Julia." "Thank you." Margaret hesitated before lowering herself into the chair beside Henry, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of her cup. Julia could feel her unease and decided to break the silence with light conversation, hoping it might ease some of the tension. "I thought it'd be nice for us to share breakfast together," Julia began, passing the plate of toast across the table. "I remember Alexander used to say that breakfast was his favorite meal of the day. He said it always set the tone for everything that followed." Margaret's expression softened at the mention of Alexander, though a shadow of sadness still lingered in her eyes. She took a deep breath, finally reaching for the toast and buttering a slice. "He was always optimistic, wasn't he? Saw the world in a way that made you think, maybe it wasn't so bad after all." Julia nodded, smiling at the memory. "Yes, he had a way of seeing the good in everyone and everything. It was one of the things I admired most about him." The kitchen grew quiet for a moment, and then Margaret looked up, meeting Julia's gaze for the first time with something other than guardedness. "I know, I've been difficult," she began, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't mean to be. It's just, I've lost so much, and it's hard to believe that there are still people who care." Julia's heart softened. She reached across the table, resting her hand on Margaret's, a gentle gesture of reassurance. "You're not alone anymore, Margaret. Whatever burdens you carry, we'll face them together." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she blinked them away quickly, not wanting to reveal the depth of her vulnerability. But Julia could see that this moment of openness was a small victory, a step toward the trust they all needed to rebuild. After breakfast, Julia suggested a walk in the nearby park. She could tell that Henry, despite his age and frail health, longed for a sense of freedom. The fresh air and the familiar sound of birds chirping might, she hoped, offer a kind of gentle healing. The park was a peaceful sanctuary with winding paths, tall trees, and benches nestled in quiet corners. They walked slowly, with Julia and Henry taking the lead while Margaret followed a few steps behind, her hands clasped tightly. As they walked, Henry shared stories of Alexander's childhood. "He was always getting into scrapes," he chuckled, his eyes shining with fondness. "Climbing trees, building things out of whatever he could find. Margaret would fuss over every bruise and scratch, but he was unstoppable." Julia laughed, feeling warmth spread through her at the thought of Alexander as a boy, fearless and full of curiosity. She looked over her shoulder, hoping to see a smile on Margaret's face. But Margaret's gaze was distant, her mind clearly wrestling with the weight of her memories. After a while, they found a bench under a large oak tree, and Julia invited them to sit. Henry sank down with a contented sigh, while Margaret sat more reluctantly, her eyes scanning the horizon, as if looking for something beyond their reach. "This place is beautiful," Julia remarked, hoping to draw Margaret into the conversation. "Alexander would have loved it here, don't you think?" Margaret nodded slowly. "He always loved being outdoors," she said, her voice softening. "Even as a child, he'd spend hours in the yard, just running and laughing. I used to watch him and wonder where he got all that energy." A faint smile touched her lips, and for the first time, Julia saw a glimmer of the woman she might have been, before grief hardened her spirit. Henry took Margaret's hand in his own, a small but tender gesture that Julia sensed spoke volumes. Despite the hardships they had faced, there was a bond between them that had endured, even in their darkest moments. Julia decided to share a memory of her own, one that might further bridge the gap between them. "I remember one summer," she began, smiling at the recollection. "Alexander insisted on taking me camping. I wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type, but he was so excited I couldn't say no." Henry chuckled, and even Margaret seemed intrigued. Julia continued, her eyes distant as she relived the memory. "We hiked up this trail, miles and miles, and when we finally reached the top, he just sat there, staring out at the view, like he could see the whole world. He told me that life was too short to spend indoors." Margaret's gaze softened, her defenses melting just a little more. "That sounds like him," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "Always wanting to see more, do more." They sat in a companionable silence, each of them lost in memories of the man who had brought them together, despite their grief. Julia felt a renewed sense of purpose settle over her. Alexander's legacy, his spirit, was alive in each of them, binding them together in a way that transcended their individual sorrows. The walk back to Julia's home was quiet but comfortable, a contrast to the tension that had marked their earlier days together. Julia could see that Margaret was beginning to trust her, and though it was a tentative step, it was one that gave her hope. As they reached the front door, Margaret paused, looking at Julia with an expression that was both grateful and cautious. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper, "for everything." Julia smiled, resting a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We're family now, Margaret, and family looks out for each other." Inside, as they settled back into the warmth of Julia's home, each of them felt a small weight lift, a quiet but profound shift toward healing. Julia knew there were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and pain, but for now, they were together, bound by love, loss, and the shared determination to find peace. Over the next few weeks, life at Julia's home began to settle into a comforting rhythm. Each morning started with quiet breakfasts, shared moments, and gentle conversations that seemed to mend the delicate threads between them. Margaret and Henry were learning to adapt, slowly opening up to Julia's kindness and the safe space she provided. Julia could see the shift in them, small but significant, like flowers cautiously blooming after a harsh winter. One evening, after dinner, Julia suggested a new routine. Every Friday, they would spend the evening sharing stories. She hoped that by revisiting joyful memories, they might all begin to heal. Margaret was hesitant at first, but Henry, encouraged by Julia's warmth, gently nudged her to participate. That Friday evening, they gathered in Julia's cozy living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting a warm light across their faces. Julia poured tea and passed around small plates of cookies, creating a sense of calm that invited conversation. "So," Julia began with a smile, "I thought we could each share a story, something that brings us joy or something we're proud of. It doesn't have to be about Alexander, just something meaningful." Henry was the first to speak, sharing a story from his childhood, about a fishing trip with his father. His eyes sparkled with nostalgia as he described the smell of the lake, the thrill of catching his first fish, and the pride he felt seeing his father's approving smile. It was a story he hadn't told in years, and Julia could see that revisiting it brought him both joy and a touch of bittersweet sadness. When it was Margaret's turn, she hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her teacup. Julia offered her a reassuring smile, silently encouraging her to speak. "There was this summer," Margaret began, her voice barely more than a whisper. "When Alexander was about 10 years old, we took a trip to the mountains. He was so full of energy, always running ahead, exploring. We stayed in this little cabin by the lake, and he spent hours skipping stones, trying to see who could make the most skips." She paused, her eyes glistening with the memory. "One day, he found a smooth, heart-shaped stone. He brought it to me and said, 'This is for you, Mom, so you always have a piece of the lake with you.' I still have that stone," she added softly, her voice trembling. "It's one of the few things I couldn't bear to part with." Julia reached over, gently resting a hand on Margaret's arm. "That's a beautiful memory," she said, her voice filled with empathy. "He sounds like he had a heart full of love." The three sat in silence for a moment, each reflecting on the fragments of memories they held on to, like pieces of a puzzle that, when joined together, painted a portrait of love and loss. As the weeks passed, Julia noticed that Margaret and Henry were beginning to let go of the burden of constant sorrow, the shared stories, the quiet walks in the park, and the warmth of a supportive household were working like a balm on their wounded hearts. They even started helping with small tasks around the house, Margaret with her knack for organizing, and Henry with his gentle humor that brightened the daily routines. One afternoon, Julia took them to a nearby community center that offered classes for various hobbies: painting, pottery, gardening. She thought it might be a way for them to re-engage with life, to rediscover interests they had perhaps abandoned over the years. Henry showed immediate interest in the gardening class, his face lighting up as he discussed the vegetables and flowers he'd grown in the past. Margaret was more reserved, unsure if she wanted to join any activities, but Julia gently encouraged her. "They have a knitting class," Julia suggested, recalling a comment Margaret had made about knitting when she was younger. "You could give it a try, just once. And if it's not for you, we won't bring it up again." Margaret sighed, then nodded, her lips curling into the faintest smile. "All right, I suppose it couldn't hurt." They signed up, and over the following weeks, Julia saw them both begin to embrace these new activities. Henry's gardening class became a highlight of his week. He would come back full of enthusiasm, describing the different plants he was learning to care for, the friends he was making. Margaret, to her own surprise, found comfort in the knitting group. She wasn't the only older woman there, and soon she began to enjoy the companionship, the sense of belonging that came with shared conversations and laughter. Julia felt a quiet joy watching them blossom. Each new day seemed to bring a spark of life back into their eyes, a glimmer of the people they had been before loss had left its mark. And for Julia, the experience was transformative. She was no longer just helping them. She was finding her own healing through their journey. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Margaret brought out a scarf she had knitted. A simple design, but beautiful in its own way. She handed it to Julia, her eyes shy but proud. "This is for you," Margaret said, her voice soft. "A thank you for everything you've done." Julia took the scarf, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Margaret, this is beautiful. Thank you. I'll treasure it." Margaret nodded, a hint of a smile on her lips. You've given us so much, Julia. I didn't think... I didn't think I could feel hope again, but here we are. They shared a moment of quiet understanding, a recognition of the distance they had traveled together, and the healing that had unfolded in each of them. Julia felt as though Alexander's spirit was present in that room, a gentle reminder of the love that had brought them all together. Months had passed since Margaret and Henry had moved in with Julia, and a soft sense of normalcy had settled into their lives. They shared meals, laughter, and quiet evenings together, each day healing the wounds they had carried. Yet, as time went on, Julia could sense a growing restlessness in Henry and Margaret. Though they were grateful for Julia's hospitality, they were beginning to feel the pull of independence, the desire to rebuild their lives outside the comfort of her home. One evening after dinner, Henry cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on Julia. "We've been talking," he began, his voice filled with both warmth and a hint of hesitation. "And we think it's time for us to find a place of our own." Julia looked from Henry to Margaret, seeing a flicker of hope and determination in their expressions. She knew this day would come, but a part of her felt a pang of sadness at the thought of letting them go. "Are you sure?" Julia asked gently. "You're welcome to stay as long as you like." Margaret smiled, her hand reaching across the table to rest on Julia's. "We know, and we can't thank you enough for everything you've done," she said softly. "But I think we're ready. We want to stand on our own again, to build something new. Just the two of us." Julia nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Then let's find you the perfect place." Over the next few weeks, Julia threw herself into helping them find a new home. Together, they visited small apartments and cozy cottages, looking for a place that felt right. After much searching, they found a modest but charming apartment near a quiet park, with large windows that filled the rooms with sunlight. Margaret loved the view of the trees outside, and Henry was delighted by the small balcony where he could set up a few plants. "This feels like home," Margaret said one afternoon, her voice filled with a quiet contentment as she stood in the empty living room, imagining the life they could build here. Henry nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I think so too. It's perfect." Julia watched them, her heart swelling with pride and happiness. "Then it's settled," she said, a wide smile on her face. "Let's get you both moved in." The move took only a few days. Julia helped them pack their belongings, and together they spent hours arranging the furniture, setting up the kitchen, and adding small touches that made the apartment feel like theirs. It was a bittersweet experience for Julia, watching them step into this new chapter. She knew she would miss their presence in her home, but she also felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that she had helped them reach this point. On their first evening in their new home, Julia brought over a bottle of wine and a basket filled with fresh bread, cheese, and fruit. They sat together on the living room floor, laughing and reminiscing about the past few months, sharing memories and hopes for the future. As they toasted to new beginnings, Henry looked at Julia, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You've given us more than just a place to stay, Julia. You've given us a chance to start over, to find happiness again." Julia felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, smiling warmly. "You both mean so much to me," she replied softly. "Helping you has given me a sense of purpose I didn't know I needed. Thank you for letting me be a part of this journey with you." Margaret reached for Julia's hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll never forget what you've done for us. You're family now." In the days that followed, Julia continued to visit often, always bringing something small, a bouquet of fresh flowers, a homemade meal, or a book she thought they'd enjoy. Margaret and Henry had begun to settle into a peaceful routine, finding joy in the simplicity of their new life. They would take long walks in the park, attend local events, and even host a few of their new neighbors for tea. One afternoon, Julia decided it was time to introduce them to her son, Liam. She wanted them to meet the young man who had become her anchor in life, her own source of strength and pride. She invited them to her home for a small dinner, excited yet nervous about the meeting. When Henry and Margaret arrived, Liam greeted them with a warm smile, his open and friendly demeanor instantly putting them at ease. He listened attentively as they shared stories about their journey, and in return, he shared his own experiences, showing a maturity and kindness that deeply impressed them both. During dinner, Margaret watched as Liam and Julia exchanged a glance that was filled with love and understanding. It reminded her of Alexander, of the bond he had shared with her, and she felt a gentle peace settle over her heart. "Liam," Margaret said softly, "you have a wonderful mother. She's done so much for us, and I can see she's raised a remarkable son." Liam smiled, glancing at his mother with pride. "She's taught me a lot about kindness and resilience," he replied, reaching out to hold her hand, "and I think I'm the lucky one." As they sat together, laughter and stories filling the room, Julia felt a profound sense of completion. She knew that despite the challenges and heartbreak, they had all come full circle. They were no longer just individuals with separate lives. They were a family, connected by the experiences they had shared and the love that had grown between them. Later that evening, as Julia walked Henry and Margaret to the door, Margaret turned to her, her eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you, Julia," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude, "for everything." Julia pulled her into a warm embrace. "No need to thank me," she murmured. "We're family now, and family takes care of each other." As they left, Julia felt a deep contentment settle over her. She knew they were ready to face the future on their own, but she also knew that they would always be a part of each other's lives. This was not an ending, but a new beginning, one filled with hope, healing, and the knowledge that love, in its many forms, had the power to transform even the deepest wounds. The autumn leaves blanketed the streets, painting New York in shades of gold and amber. Julia's house was filled with the smell of warm spices and baked apples, the quiet hum of jazz in the background, creating an atmosphere of comfort and nostalgia. Tonight was a special evening. Julia had invited Henry, Margaret, and her son Liam for a family-style gathering. It was meant to be an evening of celebration, a chance to cherish the bonds they had formed and reflect on how far they had come. As Liam arrived, he placed a basket of freshly baked rolls on the dining table, smiling warmly at Julia. "It feels good to be back, Mom," he said, embracing her. "And I'm glad you've invited Henry and Margaret. They feel like, well, family." Julia's heart swelled with gratitude. "They are family," she replied, her voice soft. "And tonight, I wanted everyone together, under one roof, to celebrate just that." Shortly after, Henry and Margaret arrived, greeted by Julia's welcoming smile. They brought with them a bottle of wine and a small bouquet of autumn flowers, a gesture of gratitude and warmth. Margaret looked around, taking in the cozy decor, her eyes bright with anticipation and contentment. "Julia, everything smells wonderful," Margaret remarked, her face lighting up as she took in the sight of the beautifully set table. "Thank you for inviting us." As they all settled around the table, a quiet, comfortable atmosphere took over. The clinking of glasses, soft laughter, and shared memories filled the air, each one contributing to the sense of unity that had grown between them. The room was aglow with candlelight, casting a gentle warmth that seemed to reflect the kindness and compassion they shared. At one point, Liam looked across the table at Henry, his expression thoughtful. "Henry," he began, "I don't know much about my grandfather. Mom's told me a little, but I'd love to hear more about him from you." Henry's face softened, his eyes glistening with both pride and a touch of sorrow. "Alexander was a remarkable man. He had this way of making everyone around him feel seen, feel important. He had dreams, big dreams, and a kindness that made him special." As Henry spoke, Julia felt a mixture of joy and sadness. Memories of Alexander flooded her mind, his laughter, his ambition, and the love they had shared. She looked at Liam, her heart full, grateful that he was there to hear these stories and carry forward the legacy of a man who had meant so much to her. Margaret joined in, her voice gentle, yet filled with conviction. "Our Alexander always cared deeply about others. He would go out of his way to help anyone in need. I see that same spirit in you, Liam," she said, her gaze resting on Julia's son, with a tenderness she hadn't shown in years. Liam nodded, humbled by their words. "Thank you," he replied quietly, "for sharing that with me. It means a lot to know that I share even a little of who he was." The conversation flowed effortlessly, moving from stories of Alexander to light-hearted tales of Julia and Liam's life. They laughed over memories, relived moments of joy, and, in their own way, honored the past by embracing the present. Later in the evening, Julia brought out a small box, which she had kept tucked away in a drawer for many years. She set it on the table, her hands lingering on it for a moment before she opened it. Inside was a collection of photographs, some faded and worn, but all precious memories of Alexander. She passed the box around, allowing each of them to hold a piece of him, to share in the moments captured in those images. As Henry and Margaret looked at the photos, a sense of peace settled over them. It was as though Alexander was there, part of this gathering, present in the love and unity that filled the room. Margaret's hand trembled as she held a photo of Alexander as a young man, his smile as vibrant as ever. "Thank you, Julia," Margaret whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "for keeping these and for sharing them with us. I feel like I found a part of him again." Julia reached over and placed a comforting hand on Margaret's. "I wanted you both to have these memories," she replied gently. "It felt right to let them bring us together." The evening continued with light-hearted conversation, each one of them feeling the warmth of a shared connection. When it was time to say goodbye, Julia walked Henry and Margaret to the door, hugging them both tightly. As they stood in the crisp autumn air, Henry looked at Julia, his face full of gratitude. "We may have lost much, Julia," he said softly, "but tonight, I feel like we've gained something that can never be taken away." Julia smiled, her eyes misty. "We have," she agreed. "We've gained each other." Watching them walk down the street, hand in hand, Julia felt a profound sense of peace. They were not only healing individually, but also creating a new, unified family, bound by love, compassion, and shared memories. She returned inside to find Liam still sitting at the table, a content smile on his face. He looked up as she entered, his eyes filled with admiration. "Thank you, Mom," he said simply. "Tonight was perfect." Julia nodded, sitting beside him. "Family isn't just who we're born with, Liam," she murmured. "It's who we choose to keep close, through the highs and the lows. And tonight, we all chose each other." The room was silent, but it was the kind of silence filled with understanding, love, and hope for the future. In that moment, Julia knew they had all found the family they had been searching for. A family built not on blood, but on the strength of shared experience and the kindness they had given to one another. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.